Hello, Hüseyin. Um, I am Theo. Um, this is, of course, my systems collapse project, and even more obviously, this is a video. So as a brief outline, I have chosen to do this as something of a video oral presentation, and I've included my agenda in my midterm PDF, along with, of course, the link to this. And the idea is that the discursive oral method is, I think, more suited to the speculative nature of this assignment, and also it is a lower stakes way of delivering this information. But yes, like I said, my notes are in the documents, just plotting out the direction of this. It's also so you don't have to rewatch the video if you need to grade this. Okay, so as a general outline of where I'm going to take this, I'm going to start off with some conception and framing issues, mostly about nature of like what society and scope are we talking about, what's plausible for a disintegration type scenario, as well as the idea of collapse versus apocalypse, and what we really mean with this terminology. And then once those two things are, not resolved, but shall we say explored, I'll go into something of a chronology following Klein's Klein's trajectory that he laid out, and with the important relevant facets of a system's collapse, and talk about what the analogs to the phenomena we observe in the Bronze Age and other collapses of the pre-modern period would be in our very postmodern period. Okay, so for the issue of society, I think the major one is, are we talking about the US or are we talking worldwide? I know the assignment said a post-apocalyptic world, but there is just a level on which it is very hard to conceive of a truly worldwide recession or regression of society. I mean, global stagnation and regression in some places is, in my mind, more plausible than a uniform scaling back, because it wouldn't be uniform no matter what. So I think it makes more sense to focus on the US, or rather any specific nation. The US just happens to be the one I have the best frame of reference for. It's also the current global hegemon, or so it would like to believe. So if there is a society that could collapse, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. That's the principle here. Then with collapse versus apocalypse, collapse, I feel is a more apt term, but it does imply something total, which doesn't feel right, especially in the modern age with things being so interdependent and interconnected, that it is just, again, that the totality of it, short, frankly, of a nuclear warfare scenario, I do not see an all-out apocalypse happening. Much more feasible seems to be a slow decline and collapse of something of a more rapid Roman model, and also that happens to be more interesting to theorize about. In nuclear warfare, it's like you fire it off and yeah, okay, that's kind of it for civilization, whereas a sort of slower, more halting trajectory where things kind of spin out, and I don't know, like definitely a much more elaborate scenario that you have to think through. So, especially with Klein's noting that it could take as much as a full century for the effects to be realized, and that there's no single cause like triggering often this kind of situation, societies changing. That is the lens I will be approaching this with. It's kind of like the center cannot hold, Yeats, whatever, type of paradigm. So that out of the way, Klein, enumerates his 4 steps: the collapse of a central administrative organization, the disappearance of the traditional elite, the collapse of the central economy, followed by settlement shifts and a population decline. So that's kind of like the core 4 effects. Then after this, I'll explore like political responses, what you'd see sort of domestically and internationally. And I mean, something to note here is like the different structure of the state and of governments being nationally based rather than being, a city unit, like a city and its suburbs. So that's going to be a major theme. And then, cultural responses, like the diminished integration across societies, the emergence of, the Romantic Dark Age myths. That is particularly interesting to think about. And then what we'd see perhaps in the way of morality and normative ethics. And I draw some parallels to the present day and what sort of happened with the pandemic and how things have been quite scrambled. What happens to legitimacy and authority of any kind, not just of states and governments. And then like what changes we might see in the material culture that could mirror what we see with the Bronze Age collapse. And that will provide a kind of analog or equivalent metric, I think we should say, for determining what even is collapse, because that as an idea is very tied to some Western and, in my opinion, American ideas of what sophistication and complexity means in a society. And we'll talk about that when we get to the disappearance of the traditional elite. So, okay. So in the core trajectory, the 4 things refers to the administration. I think in any series of events, an increasingly weak federal government with power significantly shifting to states and then to cities and then to, increasingly granular units of political divisions would make quite a bit of sense, because what would happen is the national government matters when issues are international, obviously. But as things become more and more desperate, and as people become more provincial and more concerned about what is happening in their immediate environment, and less concerned with, the frontiers and abroad and interacting with other countries, the focus just naturally goes to what is happening in the very next days, what is happening in the very immediate miles to where one lives. And furthermore, as the state becomes weakened, and the state meaning the nation state, you also have people less enthusiastic and willing to enforce and stand up for the legitimacy of the state. Like, you do not get the same kind of devotion on the part of, say, law enforcement officers, and people will not feel like the same kind of threat coming from, say, like an autonomous zone operating in, call it upstate New York. It will not pose the same kind of existential threat to a state, and they will, you will have definitely a less militaristic internally response. And this is like I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a hot take on my part, I know. I mean, you could see a more fascistic, right, kind of police state emerge if you kind of follow Foucault and the boomerang effect kind of conception. But I do think you would actually see more of an apathetic affect on the part of the government and law enforcement, because they become less invested in the idea and the identity of the state, especially as the power goes to states and cities. You probably see like city identity mattering more than national identity, which is already the case. I mean, that is like a sort of a joke in New York, feeling more like a New Yorker than an American. And there is a certain logic to that I think would be strengthened by a weaker federal system, which is in part already happening, though remains to be seen. So that's the central administrative organization, of course, that a small subset of how that would go. But the disappearance of the traditional elite, in my opinion, as perhaps something of a traditional elite, probably one of the most interesting aspects of this. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. At any rate, one of the most interesting aspects of, this whole process. And I think a major part of that is the questions it calls up, as I sort of mentioned in that roadmap earlier, of what a sophisticated society is and what it means to progress and what it means to regress. Because in this conception, the disappearance of the traditional elite implies two things. It implies a more leveled society with less distinct hierarchy, which seems like something of an obvious point that would happen post-collapse, and also replacement, supplantation by a new elite. But that is not nearly as strong, because it cannot be. A huge part of the elite's legitimacy is derived from longevity. And any new elite, by definition, right, cannot have that same longevity. So basically, no matter what, the new elite is not going to be as strong, so you're going to have a more leveled society. Great. In imagining what that looks like, I think you see essentially just sort of like less money just kind of flying around, being thrown around. Cash kind of dries up in this scenario where industries are less lucrative, and like you say, have sort of these kind of like bullshit industries like marketing and consulting that there really isn't much of a need or demand for anymore. And I can't say I'd be weeping if we never had another McKinsey consultant in this world, but once you lose like the sort of highly like financialized sector and move back towards, say, like in an industrial type production focused economy, there is a marked level of economic complexity lost. Like once you're no longer trading, options and derivatives and, all kinds of triple shorted stock options, you go more back to financial instruments that are tied to the thing that they're supposed to represent, which in principle, like, not the worst thing in the world, but that is a less complex society. And you have less sort of frivolous things, and also probably like less of an underclass as well. I mean, there's a significant comparison to be made between different cities in the contemporary period and the breadth of classes that they contain. I mean, coming from New York to Athens is like something of a like surprise in that, for example, like doormen as a category, as like a profession, doesn't really exist here. And that's like, on the other hand, you don't have like your Goldman Sachs bankers here either, who, I don't know, who own Midtown and are always in their natty suits. So I could see a scenario in which you move where New York moves from a New York level of inequality to maybe an Athens level of inequality, where you don't have as much stratification and class differentiation and hard and fast distinctions. Now, I will say there is something like politically, ethically troubling about this line of thought, where inequality equals complexity, because it feels like a value judgment, even if objectively it's not. Simple societies in the archaeological world are not well thought of, to put it gently. So to say that something's simple, to say that it's not good, but to say that equal is the same as simple, well, I almost said good Marxist, as a very bad Marxist, that sticks in my craw, because why is it necessarily a regression to go from, I don't know, a society like ours that is so patently and manifestly like horrible to the people who it screws over, to a more equal and equitable, synonyms, system where distribution is, I don't know, more justly and democratically accorded, like in a really important way that is like a more complex society where you have more control, more agency. And if we're defining modernity as my friend Marshall Berman does, as, you know, people being both subjects and objects of their world, like that is a situation where people have more control over the world. And that feels like it should be hailed as an achievement rather than, I don't know, sort of looked down upon. I mean, this is something I've not quite worked out since I first encountered it in this book by Joseph Tainter. It was like called The Collapse of Complex Societies. But it seems like a significant theoretical problem, though perhaps it's best to just sidestep it and say, well, that's not what's happening here. This is not a socialist revolution that's happening, if we are to really be calling it a collapse rather than just a political event. Though, I don't know, all the terminology is a value judgment. That's a hot take. But I don't know, that is, I think that is something worth meditating on, how we conceive of different cultures and put these seemingly objective labels on them. We love a good discourse. But yeah, final point on this about the replacement by a new elite. Who that would be, dunno. I mean, I can't imagine it would be quite like a warlords scenario, like warlords running Manhattan. But more conceivable is a situation where, yeah, local politicians are much more significant, and that things happen in sort of patronage and kind of business networks in a way where our sort of like kind of currently highly anonymized economy, though not totally, like a lot of things still happens person to person in the business world, but still the anonymization will probably diminish by a lot. in terms of who exactly the new elite would be, it'd probably just be people in opportune places at opportune times. It is hard to imagine what specific institutions would produce them, if it would be like the same kind of educational caste that we have kind of going on now. I doubt it. It seems like universities would probably be hollowed out by this time. And like private schools and elite universities would probably be like a shell of their former selves, is my guess, with the economic attrition. But yeah, that is something difficult to imagine. I mean, in part because the whole point is that the new elite wouldn't really exist, certainly not in any consolidated form. So now, like moving on to the central economy and the settlement shifts point, by the 22nd century, the climate crisis will be like fairly advanced, and by fairly advanced, like very advanced. Not to the point of having run its full course by any stretch, but I mean, the current projections are that by 2030, things are irreversible. And so accordingly, 2130 is well past the watershed moment. Now, because of that, all of the crises that will come out of the climate change we're already starting to see, such as climate migration and food production shortages, will have well emerged by then. And so it will not be able to be our catalyst for any such collapse, but it will be an important weakening factor. In terms of what would actually, say, pull the trigger on things, what would really make the central economy fall in on itself would have to be probably a series of major events. We've already seen what a pandemic can do. It'd probably have to be a nastier disease than COVID to really shut shit down. Though, again, at the point where supply lines in society has been so weakened by climate change, it is possible that something even relatively benign, like a novel coronavirus. But novel coronavirus, I only saw the movie. Would be enough to do it, if you will, and that would probably be coupled with some sort of independent, or at least semi-independent, financial crisis a la 2008. However, one could certainly imagine significant displacement continuing and perhaps certainly accelerating in this scenario. And this gets to a pretty dark point. I've broken down responses, and we're kind of talking causes, core causes, right, for those first 4 points. These next two are more effect than cause. Not that those are such different and hard and fast categories, but it's political and cultural. So on the political, American society would likely be better than European society at incorporating waves of immigration. But I say that very tentatively and with a lot of reserve, in that European society has been pretty terrible with the latest migrant crisis and can be highly cruel and apathetic towards the plight of refugees. And the US is not much better, with a very unfortunate racialization of such victims. And it so happens, by the nature of geography, that a lot of the sort of at least first, second, probably third wave victims of climate change will be of non-white countries, what at least 3 years ago we called the Global South. And this has the potential to produce a fascistic response domestically, and then in the US's sort of foreign outposts, which is its own point, but bear with me, I suppose. And that does stand in contrast, right, to what I said sort of earlier, like that you would most likely see an increasing apathy on the part of governments locally. However, at the border, people who are invested in protecting the homeland, and they are real. I don't know, there is something about the exception of the frontier, what is permitted at the borderlands, and you know, it's not hard to picture the young man who would venture out and feel like he's protecting his country by committing some atrocities at the southern, perhaps even northern border. Who knows by then? However, the nature, in comparing this to what a Bronze Age collapse might have been like, a really big difference is the nation-state structure versus the city-state structure. Benedict Anderson has the canonical Benedict Anderson has quite a bit of thoughts on what an imagined community is, but the sort of the affinity that exists in the modern nation is hardly real. Whereas, like, in a city, at least there's some sort of factual basis for some whatever fellow feeling you have for your fellow citizen. It's very tenuous on the national basis. And that was kind of what I was talking about with the collapse of central administration and the reemergence of a city identity as opposed to a national identity. But in the modern day, like, you have nations that are going to want to assert themselves and feel increasingly desperate in the world. And so I think it's very plausible to see low-grade warfare on, like, the American frontier, but conceived of in the very, very broadest sense. What the proponents of the Pax Americana like to think America is and where it is with its 800 current military bases abroad. It is, a sort of low intensity, sort of skirmish level of fighting just about everywhere. Seems a pretty likely outcome. I don't know. I think overall the picture I am kind of trying to paint is one of this kind of languor, and there's sort of like this lazy collapse where no one is really particularly motivated to get on it and fix it and do something. There's a sense of having been beaten down by the world and not able to control it and at its mercy. And that is something quite anti-modern in a way. If as mentioned earlier, Berman's words, modernity is being subject and object of the world. This is a state where you'd move much more into the object category as, say, the climate gets completely out of hand and beyond human control. That is no longer subject to human will. It's escaped. It is its own agent. It is its own subject. The risk of making this too literary, right? But it then turns people into objects in a way that they haven't been probably since the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, that is kind of a frightening thought. I mean, there's a guy called Chrisman who has quite a few interesting thoughts on this, especially on the political responses. Though he's kind of unhinged. I'm not sure. He's definitely not a proper source to cite. He's no tainter. What a great name. But yeah, that is what our politics could look like. Again, kind of just all submerged in this haze, if you will. Yeah, so onto culture, because culture is downstream from politics, not the other way around. As Klein mentions, you have this diminished socio-political integration and the emergence of romantic dark age myths. But I think in addition to that, you have like a change in like morality and what's acceptable. I think a lot of places are currently in the throes of this transitional period. You see it in academia, like what is rigor now after like 2.5, whatever it was, years of Zoom school when grades didn't mean anything and now people are like kind of incompetent and whatever. How do you grade people, especially because the pandemic isn't over? And then that's like a very direct connection, but there's also plenty of other muddle of what, I don't know, things, I don't know, hard to get into that one, I will say, because that is a very nebulous thing to discuss without making personal, and also not something one should make personal. I feel like this is a school assignment after all. But anyway, that's just a note on morality. I mean, when I was originally writing a story, that was the thing I was sort of zeroing in on. And I wish I could have been like very, very evocative, but no. I think I will leave it at it as what is interesting and unique about that scenario is you have a state of exception that declares itself, and this goes back to the idea of agency and a lack of human agency. Like Agamben's political theory and like his idea of the sovereign, and well, obviously it comes from everyone's favorite Nazi, Heidegger, of like he who is sovereign is the one who can declare the state of exception. Right, you have a state of exception that would sort of happen of its own accord, and that is again making people objects of their world and not into subjects. And yeah, responses to that is where you get the muddled morality. So, but for the other points, right? The lower socio-political integration. This is something that straddles the cultural, economic, and political effects. Certainly, trade and economic contexts diminish by quite a bit with virtually any pattern of causation. That seems to be a pretty universal effect across whatever permutation. And on the sort of national state level, things sort of spin out. I think it's very apt to picture like a centrifugal chamber where things literally fly from the center out to the edges. And then yes, the mythology of the Age of Heroes is very hard to think of a modern analog because we don't really do heroes anymore. We don't really do, I mean, when's the last time someone wrote an epic that entered the literary canon? Like, we don't think like we used to. Who is deified in our society? It is no longer the strong man. It's a very good thing that men don't have to be strong and bulky anymore. There's a place for me in this. Who would get romanticized? I think I mean, there will always be the cult of sort of the trad masculine whatever. And already, I mean, looking at who we culturally deify now, I think the most notable pattern is that there's very little pattern, and that it's a very individual and fragmented decision. But yeah. Shit, I think our roommate's coming back. Sorry. Oh, okay, I guess not. Sorry, that would have been bad. Yes, so the mythology, I mean, I'm not even sure if people would really have the time to be writing poetry and whatnot, if it would be front of mind. Though my English professor from last semester, Patrick dear, he's an English professor, which is a lot, trust me. But he did some very interesting scholarship on World War II, which was itself conceived of as something of a literary dark age in the scholarship. And people were like, nothing important was going on in Britain at that time. When, to the contrary, writers and artists and, poets and dramatists were producing at full tilt, full swing. It just sort of got lost. Certainly, like, propaganda was a confounder, a suppressor. But yes, it is something of a fallacy that art kind of vanishes during times of hardship, and rather instead, as Deere wrote, it can assume a really central importance in making sense of the world. So you'd probably see, frankly, a lot of art that served ostensibly as an escape, but like on a deeper level, maybe even a subconscious one on the part of authors, contained themes and explorations of like the present crises. So yeah, a pretty hard to unravel scenario. And I feel like I have failed at making a total picture of painting like one world and one outcome. And I have done so at that expense in order to convey a broader range of the possibilities of what could happen. And I do apologize for this being 40 minutes. I do hope you played on like double time or something, because I am not at my sharpest. It has been very hard figuring out exactly how the world will end. But yeah, I do think that it is also a legitimate approach to this assignment, if I may put in a last-ditch effort after rambling for 40 minutes to defend my method. I do think that's a legitimate approach to this assignment, in that it captures the spirit of it, I think. It's fundamentally a speculative thing. And I think admitting that and confessing to the range of possible outcomes and a range of possible circumstances is probably the most honest way to go about it. But yes, thank you for watching. I hope this was okay. Not too tedious. But maybe it replaced your morning podcast one day. But yeah, thank you. Goodbye.